a dictator, holed up in a heavily fortified military fortress right in the heart of Caracas. Then you have a top-secret Delta Force raid executed with what seems like impossible speed.
And a legal blueprint, right. A plan drawn up decades ago from the capture of another infamous tyrant.
Exactly. And all of these forces just collided in this executive action. It's so stunning. It completely redefines the boundaries of international accountability.
It really was a geopolitical earthquake. For years, analysts debated whether the U.S. would ever actually risk the military action needed to physically remove a sitting head of state.
To bring them to trial.
And the answer, which was delivered in, less than 30 minutes, it just fundamentally shifts the goalposts of foreign policy.
That's the core of it, really.
Yeah.
So today, we are diving deep into the sources that document the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. We're looking at the charges, the unbelievable complexity of the military operation, and the massive constitutional showdown this whole thing triggers in Washington.
Our mission today is to cut through all that noise and give you the full briefing. You need to understand not just the fact of the capture, but the meticulous, decade-spanning legal strategy that made it possible.
And the precedent it sets.
And the very dangerous precedent it sets for every other strongman, across the globe.
Okay, let's hit the 90-second news hook right now. This is the essential overview for you. President Trump announced the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores.
From what the White House called a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas.
Right. And the stated purpose was crystal clear. Bring them to the U.S. to face these devastating narco-terrorism charges under a newly unsealed federal indictment. The operation itself, months in the making. Codename, Operation Absolute Resistance or Resolve.
And it was a swift, surgical raid. It drew lessons from specialized intelligence work, and planning that, frankly, has never been deployed at this scale against a sovereign nation's capital.
So the core takeaway is just monumental. A major authoritarian figure who the U.S. had formally indicted as the head of a criminal narco-terrorist enterprise
was forcibly removed from his own country
and is now headed to a U.S. courtroom. This isn't just an arrest, it's an extraordinary extension of American law enforcement power.
And that extension, that extraordinary part, it all hinges on the severity of the alleged crimes. To even begin to understand the justification for using military force, we have to start with the why.
The charges themselves.
The specific charges that the U.S. Department of Justice leveled against Maduro.
The U.S. was really careful to frame this as a law enforcement action against a criminal organization, not a political overthrow. They targeted what they call the Cartel of the Suns. So what picture did that indictment actually paint?
It painted a picture of a criminal state. This wasn't passive corruption. The indictment details systemic corruption going all the way back to 1999. It alleges Maduro wasn't just a beneficiary. He was the active leader of this Cartel of the Suns.
So he was leveraging the power of the state itself.
Fundamentally, transforming Venezuela into basically a launchpad and a safe harbor for massive drug trafficking.
And crucially, this wasn't just drug trafficking. The U.S. legal team went for a much, much stronger classification.
Precisely. That is the strategic key here. The centerpiece of the 4 counts against him is narco-terrorism conspiracy. This is the charge that lets the U.S. pull in all its counterterrorism authorities and resources.
Okay, so that's the connection.
That's the connection. The indictment alleges that since 1999, Maduro and his inner circle consciously partnered with designated foreign terrorist organizations, specifically the FARC and the ELN from Colombia.
So if they had just charged him with running a cocaine ring, the whole legal and operational justification, it might have looked very different.
Oh, completely different. But by connecting him to FTOs, you bring the full weight of the post-9/11 legal architecture to bear on him.
And what's the core allegation there? What was the deal?
The allegation is that Maduro wasn't just taking drug money. He was allegedly providing these designated terrorist groups with protection, with safe zones inside Venezuela, and even military-grade weapons.
Military-grade.
Yeah, the sources mention things like stingers and rocket-propelled grenades, and all of that was in exchange for drug proceeds. That connection transforms the whole thing from just, regular crime into a direct threat to U.S. national security, legally speaking.
And the scale of this.
Yeah.
We're talking about staggering numbers, right?
The documents charge him with conspiring to import thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. And look, this wasn't some backwoods operation.
No.
The source material details how they allegedly used Venezuela's own state infrastructure, the presidential hangar at the main airport, government naval vessels to move drug shipments.
Wait, the presidential hangar?
The presidential hangar. There's an allegation that it was used to load a massive 5.5-ton shipment of cocaine onto a jet back in 2006.
That detail is it's crucial. It suggests the enterprise was completely integrated into the highest levels of the state. And this corruption, it ran in the family, too.
It was definitely a family enterprise. The co-conspirators listed include his wife, Celia Flores, and his son, Nicolas Ernesto Maduro, who was known as Nicolasito, or the Prince.
The Prince.
And we saw examples of them leveraging diplomatic immunity itself. While Maduro was foreign minister, he allegedly provided diplomatic passports to drug traffickers to make sure they'd sail past any scrutiny.
It's the highest level of state protection being used for criminal activity. They didn't just launder money through the state. They allegedly turned the state itself into the syndicate. Okay, so that gives us the judicial context. But the tactical question is still the elephant in the room. How do you physically pull a sitting dictator out of his own capital city? This is where we move into the action.
This was Operation Absolute Resolver Resistance, and it really represents a masterclass in specialized military planning. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, confirmed the mission was planned for months. This was not a snap decision.
No, you don't just send Delta Force into a foreign capital on a whim. And the preparation details are incredible.
No, you don't. The sources reveal that U.S. forces built a literal replica of Maduro's compound, and they practiced on it for months. They needed to know every sightline, every response time, every way in and out.
And they had intel on the inside.
It seems so. The CIA reportedly had an asset operating inside the Venezuelan government, providing real-time tracking and location confirmation.
That level of prep just speaks to the risk of this mission. So what about the actual deployment? Getting forces into Caracas without being spotted sounds almost impossible.
It was monumental. General Kane confirmed over 150 aircraft launched from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere, all at once. But the key for the extraction force was stealth. The helicopters flew into Venezuelan airspace at a terrifyingly low altitude, 100 feet above the water.
100 feet. Wow, that's just skimming the waves.
It minimizes your radar signature until the absolute last possible moment. They were betting everything on tactical surprise.
So how did they deal with Venezuela's air defenses? They must have had some.
They did. The surprise was layered. As the assault helicopters got close to Caracas, U.S. forces successfully dismantled and disabled those air defense systems. At the same time, President Trump claimed the U.S. turned off almost all of the lights in Caracas.
So the city went dark.
Plunged into darkness. It wasn't just for show, it was a tactical move to disorient security forces and conceal the assault force.
So what happened when they reached the fortress?
The entire assault, from insertion to capture, lasted less than 30 minutes. The intelligence was spot on. Maduro was inside, trying to get to his secure area. Reports indicate he tried to get into his solid steel safe room door.
But he didn't make it.
He was bum-rushed right so fast by the U.S. forces that he couldn't lock himself inside. The speed completely negated his best defense.
What if he had sealed that door? What was the plan?
Well, the sources say the team was ready with massive blowtorches or explosives to breach that door in under a minute. But they didn't need to. They moved too fast.
So they grabbed him and Flores.
Apprehended, secured, and immediately extracted. They were flown first to a U.S. warship and then on to New York for trial. One helicopter was hit, a couple of guys were injured, but the operation was a success.
The military component was surgical, effective, but this is where the conversation turns, right? From tactical success to legal and constitutional controversy. Removing a head of state by force, even if you call him illegitimate, is an incredibly aggressive act. What makes this legally defensible for the U.S.?
The entire legal scaffolding for this rests on one specific historical event: the capture of Manuel Noriega in Panama back in 1989.
The Noriega precedent.
That's it. It created what is now considered settled law, and it's what validates the U.S. government's ability to prosecute Maduro.
So break that down for us. What did that precedent actually establish?
The key legal doctrine is that jurisdiction is independent of the method of capture. When Noriega was captured and brought to Miami, the federal courts ruled that the way he was captured, even by force, even from foreign soil, it doesn't invalidate the court's jurisdiction over the criminal charges themselves.
So the court basically says, we don't care how you got here. You're here now, and the indictment is valid.
That's it. It's like a valid ticket rule. Once the defendant is physically in custody, the trial proceeds. The courts essentially put up a firewall. They won't review the legality of the military force, only the validity of the criminal charges.
What about state immunity?
The courts defer to the executive branch on that, and since the U.S. government already disputes Maduro's legitimacy and the charges frame his actions as a private criminal enterprise,
The Cartel of the Suns.
right, he will almost certainly be denied immunity, just like Noriega was.
So from a purely judicial standpoint, the administration feels like it's on solid ground. But politically, constitutionally, the critics are loud. They're arguing this undermines Congress.
And that is the crucial constitutional clash. Secretary of State Marco Rubio defended the operation, saying that warning Congress beforehand endangers the mission. You had Senate Majority Leader John Thune praising it as decisive action.
But the critics are looking past the mission's success. They're focused on the mechanism, aren't they? The idea that an indictment can justify military action.
That is precisely the argument. They argued this whole operation violates the Constitution's commitment of the power to initiate hostilities to Congress, specifically the War Powers Resolution.
So their concern is structural.
Exactly. They're worried that allowing a prosecutorial decision, an indictment, to serve as a de facto justification for military action, which is functionally an act of war, well, it effectively inverts the constitutional design.
What do you mean by inverts the constitutional design? Break that down.
Well, traditionally, Congress holds the power to declare war or authorize military force. The executive branch then executes that policy. This operation, critics argue, flips that script.
How so?
It suggests the executive branch, through the Department of Justice, can decide a foreign leader is a criminal and then use the military's top-tier assault capabilities to enforce a criminal warrant. It bypasses the congressional debate required for starting hostilities abroad.
It creates a new, incredibly aggressive tool for foreign policy, where the hammer of the military is wielded under the guise of an international police action.
And the result is a dramatic expansion of unilateral executive power, without the constitutional checks of the legislative branch. That is the essential debate we are left with. The operation was surgically clean and the judicial precedent is set.
But the policy question is still wide open.
Is a criminal indictment enough to legitimize military force used to achieve foreign policy goals? The U.S. has now drawn a very clear line.
We saw a decisive, high-stakes operation against a regime actively threatening U.S. security through massive drug trafficking and ties to designated foreign terrorist organizations. The execution was surgical. The legal path seems well-paved thanks to that Noriega precedent.
But while the courts may see this as a straightforward criminal case, a domestic legal matter, the core conflict is really about the separation of powers. This deep dive shows that the political and constitutional reverberations of this action are far from over.
And that takes us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Maduro's capture sets a stark new norm. If a foreign leader is formally indicted by the United States as a criminal, especially on charges that include narco-terrorism, the physical borders of his nation might no longer protect him from American action. How many other dictators, strongmen, and corrupt officials around the world are checking their arrest warrants and maybe reviewing their safe room door plans today?